Okay, welcome to the second of today's Atrium presentations. Chris Watson, I've known Chris for quite a long time, haven't I, Chris? I won't tell you how long.
Absolutely.
Because that will show up Chris's age and mine. But we both worked in the Ministry of Works, and for those younger folk that are listening in, we'll explain what the Ministry of Works was much later on. And at that time, Chris, together with the architectural section, if I remember right, Chris, developed Post Occupancy Evaluation. It was a very keen part of the quality equation, maintaining the quality, and the idea of going back and looking at buildings after you've built them so that you could see not so much the mistakes, but Chris will talk about those today, but the things that we could do better in buildings was the whole driving force behind post-occupancy evaluation. So over to you, Chris. It's going to be really interesting finding out what and where is post-occupancy evaluation today in New Zealand, since those times when we were much younger, architects and engineers in the Ministry of Works. Over to you, Chris.
Thanks, Regan. Yes, as it indicates here, I'm going to be speaking about post-occupancy evaluation, which is the systematic process for reviewing buildings to find out what's worked well and not so well, and then taking those lessons learned and seeing if we can eliminate the mistakes or the defects from future buildings. So firstly, I'll speak about one example of a building defect, that is to say something which compromises the productivity or well-being of the stakeholders of a building. And that example is the slippery when wet entrance. I'll then go on to give some background about the post-occupancy evaluation method that we developed here in New Zealand, and speak about some examples of evaluations in other climates. And finally, I'll talk about the process I've trialed to eliminate the worst of the defects. So this is a university building entrance which was reported to be slippery when wet, and it was reported by the occupants, the staff and students, etc. Now, after the evaluation, the university took up my recommendation and repaired the problem. So nobody was hurt in this building as far as I know. But I've seen this problem or this defect reported in quite a number of buildings, and I started to notice it on other buildings as I went around town. For example, this one at a Picton shopping centre, this one at a shopping mall in Beijing, this one at an office on the Wellington waterfront, this one at a building entrance in Webb Street, just a couple of blocks south of the school. And here's one shown on the LifeMark website. They're promoting buildings for people of all ages, but they've designed what appears to be a slippery when wet entrance shown on the left there, which is partially covered up by those two mats. And I was doing some evaluations last year up at Remuera, and every day I would go through the Newmarket railway station and I'd see these signs about the slippery when wet entrance, and I'd sometimes notice the staff rolling out the mats in the morning which partially cover the slippery area. Not everybody can read the signs though, such as this blind man who came past when I was there. And here's an example which was reported in several articles in the Otago Daily Times. You can see the warning sign up the top there, the slippery tiles below, and the drain to take the water away that fell on the floor. I can think of at least 5 possible ways that water could get on the floor. Naturally, it could come in on people's shoes during wet weather, and perhaps the fire hose reels which are around the mezzanine, perhaps they could drip, or they could be used in a student prank, or worse still, they could be used in a fire when people are trying to escape the building perhaps in a state of panic. And finally, and lastly of all, water could come in through leaks in the roof. Now there was, during the 18 years, first 18 years of this building, the university received 80 written complaints about this floor, and there was 12 people seriously injured. The last person was Catherine Casey, who was permanently disabled. And the only good news to this sorry story is that her sister was a barrister, and she was able to take the university to court and force them to fix it. So why do we keep building these slippery when wet entrances? That's one question. Perhaps it's more useful to say how we can prevent them. But we've spawned a whole industry of slippery when wet signs, such as the prevalence of this problem. So now I'd like to tell you about the post-occupancy evaluation method, which is designed to overcome such problems, or at least identify them and feed those lessons back into the process. That was designed back in the period between 1978 and 83. The government architect was Graham Miskimmon, and his deputy, Duncan Joyner, was in charge of research and design, research and architectural design. And there was quite a few regional offices around the country. Now, Duncan engaged 3 lecturers from the School of Architecture, that's David Kernan, John Gray and John Dash, to develop a post-occupancy evaluation process, and that is described in the guidelines document, which is no doubt in the School of Architecture library. Now, the beauty of that process is that it was a very egalitarian process. Such was the nature of the New Zealand public service at that time. And that was quite simply applying Deming's quality cycle, the PDCA cycle, from quality management. And it was to demonstrate and to be accountable to Parliament and to select committees and so on, to prove that architectural buildings were produced to a good standard of quality. They realised at the time that people's work and well-being, in other words, the utility of the building, depended not just on the design of the many features and qualities of each building, but also on the ways that the buildings are used over their lifetime and the conditions under which they are used. And by conditions, I mean things like day, night, summer, winter, weather conditions, conditions perhaps of austerity and maintenance cycles, and other such times. Often it's emergency conditions. So buildings have to work not just in normal times, but under emergency conditions, especially in projects like police buildings. And one of the other groups to inform the New Zealand government architect at that time was the US Army Corps of Engineers. Now, there was 2 people working for them. There was the late Professor Wolf Prizer and Professor Bob Shibley. And they were working on evaluating barracks, and that translated directly into the work that was done here. And I see this article from last year in the Metropolis magazine, where the US Army Corps of Engineers is still using post-occupancy evaluation. And they found that there was a $77 returned for every dollar spent on post-occupancy evaluation. So now I'd like to tell you a little bit more about the stakeholder-centric process, which makes it so egalitarian. And that's compared with other processes that you might imagine, like surveys or rating schemes for buildings and such like. The process's unique feature is that it has an open topic. So that is to say, the evaluator doesn't decide what the topics are. Those topics come from the stakeholder's perception of responding to the objective prompt, which is the building itself, as they move through the building, walk through in the interviews, and what we call the spatial agenda. The process also enables them to talk about specific elements in buildings. For example, there may be many windows on all different levels and all different sides of buildings, but there may be issues or problems or things that work particularly well on just some of those buildings and part of the building. of course, it also enables people to negotiate the building's use and conditions to achieve the productivity and well-being. And here's an example in another university building where the building features puts people in close proximity, and they're only able to concentrate if people behave in a very quiet way. And this man is demonstrating how he's not able to concentrate because the people are walking past in close proximity. So I've applied this process in throughout New Zealand, in many cases in Australia, in Europe, and in Russia. And as you can see on the left there are many building types in which we've used, many, especially public buildings, many different types of public buildings, and a number of commercial building types as well. And that is on buildings from brand new right up to 170 years old. So now I'll give you some examples of two of those building types. Firstly, there's one up here in the town of Bodø in Arctic Norway. It's just near the Lofoten Islands. And I was up there during the summer of 2017. And that was interesting, of course, because we had sun on all four facades of the building. And here is the building. You can see part of the building on the left there, the dark coloured building. And this was an educational building. And in the foreground here is the site of one of the problems, quite a serious one, of children being endangered by vehicles at the entrance. That's a problem which has also been reported in one or more New Zealand schools and a school in Scotland. And here is the a building in a very, very hot part of Australia, which had one of the issues there was a common one in Wellington buildings and elsewhere, and that is that the facades and the eaves of the building incorporate places for birds to roost. And of course, where there are birds, they leave their droppings, which not only are unsightly, but also they can carry about 60 different types of infections, both viral, parasitic, and also fungal and bacterial. So that can be quite dangerous. And pigeons can carry deadly diseases affecting people. So finally, what I'd like to tell you about is a checklist that I developed to eliminate the more common and serious defects that are reported in buildings. Because I think that we should be able to eliminate these completely. We should have had enough of them, quite frankly, and we should be able to get on top of them. According to the project teams, that is the architects, their clients, the capital works managers and others in the project team, they all have a common cause. They're often very expensive, like that one at Dunedin cost over $18 million to repair just in the building project. We see the same problems occurring internationally. And some of them have been around for quite some time, quite a long time, even though we understand the physics of them and we understand how to solve the problems. The common cause that the building project teams refer to is the other guy. It's always the other guy's fault. So there's something funny happening about not being able to get over this hurdle and eliminate the problem for good. One way of trying to eliminate their problems was used by Defence recently. They asked me for the lessons learned for two building types so that they could eliminate those from a building program which is due to be underway shortly. They have a very rigorous building benefits process that they use to request the money from government. And fortunately, we have done about 10 evaluations of defence buildings in Australia and New Zealand, and that included around 50 buildings. So identified the lessons learned, selected those which were more common and serious, and then we described those features so that they could be eliminated from the new building program. Now, managers and architects either didn't know the defect would compromise work and well-being, or they did know and they built it anyway, perhaps through the pressure of time or budget. So whatever we do to try and eliminate that process must cater for both possibilities. I looked at what made Toyota the most successful car company in the world. They manufacture over 10 million cars a year. They have a culture of learning, of stopping to fix problems so that they can get them right first time instead of sweeping them under the mat. They use a visual control system and they go and see the problems. And really that's a little bit like what we do in post-occupancy evaluation. We use a lot of photography to make the defects visible. And I also is influenced by the work of Dr. Atul Gawande from Boston, I believe, who wrote about checklists, and he looked at how they were used in aviation since 1937 and applied them to medicine. So he looked at how they achieve critical requirements, such as to keep the patient safe or to keep the aeroplane in the air, in these complex processes in such a way that they could be rapidly implemented in a process. They involved teams, so crew on a plane or operating theatre personnel, to achieve a very high level of safety and compliance. And of course, they used in operating rooms, both in the pre-op area in a surgical theatre, pre-incision, and just before a patient is, the operation is wrapped up and completed. So what Dr. Gawande advises is to take the feedback, apply it in various review stages, use very precise language, apply it with a team approach, and thoroughly test the checklist before it's implemented. So I tried this out on building problems. Hence, you can see here I've changed it to safe when wet entrance, described the problem and the reported effects. I've then shown some examples of it to remind us that the building industry really does cause this problem, and then given them a risk matrix to complete down below there. Now here the architect or the capital works manager can go through and look at their risk exposure. What would it cost if we built one of these slippery when wet entrances, in this case, into the building to repair it? And would there be any health and safety or reputational problem? And then they choose how they're going to manage that, describe the process or the mitigation, and prove that it's happened. So that there's a track record on file of how they've handled that risk. Now that really just comes down to care and knowledge, which I believe is a definition of professionalism. So I tried this process with architects and capital works managers, about 20 different people. And in the end, I surveyed them and they said that they would use that their buildings were at risk of these problems or these defects, which I identified to them. And they said that they would cost up to $5 million each, plus have safety and reputational problems. They said it would be worth applying such a process as the checklist, which you see here. And they said that the client was primarily responsible for implementing that. Finally, they said that they would like to check their projects for between 20 and 60 lessons learned. And of course, once those defects are managed in such a way, the risk matrix can be summarized very simply online or even on a smartphone. So I've given a direct example of the slippery when wet entrance, a little bit about the evaluation method that we've developed here in New Zealand, given you some examples of evaluations in hot and cold climates, and talked about a way of eliminating the more common and serious defects. And now I'd be pleased to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much, Chris. That's really, really interesting. I've got one question. If post occupancy evaluation is so much tied to the quality and the outputs that we do, why do we sort of, as a human species, it almost seems, because you found it was international, it was, some of those buildings were 175 years. Why is it that we don't quite get it? That, the idea of going back and checking our buildings and seeing what doesn't work seems almost axiomatic. You sort of don't even need to defend that idea. But why is it that we don't seem to do it? Have you got a view on that? I'm sure you have, actually.
Well, I guess people are under pressure to respond to what they're doing, and they don't have to do it. And maybe it's a little bit of laziness, and I think there's also confidence, because the mindset you need to drive a project through is maybe a different sort of mindset than you do need to apply to check that you're doing it right. Plus, there's also the defining, the segmenting of responsibilities. People are in the pre-Rogernomics days perhaps had a broader sense of what public service is than they do now.
Becky.
Thanks, Chris. That was really interesting, and not something I know anything about. So, but what I was interested in is whether, first of all, so are you meaning that the whole kind of idea of post-occupancy evaluation was developed in New Zealand? There's a New Zealand way of doing.
Well, the New Zealand method, as it became known, was developed at the School of Architecture for the government architect.
Right.
And it was implemented by the government architect's office in various government departments who were, at that time, they were participating in it. I remember Defence was one. I can't remember, I don't know who the others were, but there were several of them. And that was based on work which Duncan Joyning knew about in England when he did his PhD there, I understand. So he brought back the knowledge and awareness, and the New Zealand method, as it became known, was developed, as I say, right here in Wellington.
Right, okay. And can I ask an extension to that? Do you know of any work that kind of, in addition to the sort of more technical evaluation, looks at sort of socio-cultural evaluation? And what I mean by that is, I've been talking with some people up in Waikanae about papakainga, which, a sort of Māori set of housing, I guess, is an easy way to translate that, but for kaumātua old people. And what they want to know is whether the lives of their elders improve after they get the housing. And I just wondered if there were any methods that you'd come across or knew about that kind of add to the technical evaluation and sort of overlay a sort of cultural, social.
Well, yes, what I would say is that it's all about the choice of the stakeholders. We try to get every stakeholder, every group with an interest in the building represented. Mm-hmm. So obviously the old people are a key stakeholder in an evaluation of housing for kaumātua. Sure. And of course there are others like their family and the design and project team that put it together and the maintenance people who look after it. Mm. And within the project team there's the builder and there are probably others as well that you can think of. So the New Zealand approach is particularly strong on ensuring that people can speak for themselves. So we wouldn't have an external expert come in and speak for kaumātua if we can have kaumātua speak for themselves. Mm-hmm. And similarly, we prefer to have disabled people to speak for to represent their issues rather than a disabled person's expert. There are some situations, however, where the stakeholders cannot be present. An example of that is future generations. So the environmental effect of a building has an effect, compromises the lives or may compromise the life of future generations. We can't get those people to come and attend the POE. So what we have is a environmental or usually an architectural specialist on green issues to come, and we've had some from Auckland and Wellington do that.
Okay, thank you.
My experience, Chris and Becky, is that kaumātua have no trouble talking.
Yeah, we find that once these small groups take us around the buildings and they start talking about little things that work particularly well or they don't work so well, that they very quickly, the ideas bounce off each other and we get a very detailed and thorough knowledge, and they can see us recording and documenting what they're talking about. So they are usually pretty modest in their requests, and all they ask for is a few things to make, to tweak the building up a little bit better. And the other point I'd make, Regan, that touches on what you asked before, is that in evaluating these buildings, it's important to realise that almost everything works pretty well. There are only usually a few little minor things that fail. So we don't need to evaluate everything in a building, only those things which the stakeholders raise, given that we've identified all the stakeholders and involved them.
Amina, did you have a question?
Yes, I do. How did you read my mind? I didn't do anything yet. Hello, Chris. Lovely to see you this way. Even if we are not in person, it's nice to have a connection through the Zoom. And thank you very much for the presentation. And thank you for pointing at the influence from our school, which I wasn't aware of. I did know that during the 1980s, there were some glorious discussions, which we haven't really written proper histories of yet, happening around the school that were actually investigating or trying to further the link between psychology and built environment. And what Rebecca was asking about could easily be something that as a school we have possibility to continue developing, because these are uncharted territories of how do we measure cultural well-being or happiness well-being, generally well-being, and if we don't know how do we measure that in the society generally, then how do we know how to measure buildings influencing it, right? So there are kind of two steps in there. But a science for measuring happiness and well-being is starting to develop nicely, so we can actually start to anchor some of that science into evaluations of buildings and aspirations that we have in that area. But what I find really fascinating in the presentation that you have given us, Chris, is the fact that it's important to think about the different participants in the process and users and ability to think through different groups and how different groups experience the same thing becomes one important element, because the designers and the design team, the people doing the building, will always have their own set of views. It is about the multiplicity of other perspectives that come through in the post-occupancy evaluations that are really important to be brought in.
Yes, thank you for those kind words. Yes, I'd say that what the strength of getting all these users involved is that we've got the diversity from the universal set of stakeholders. So we try to get everybody involved, and once you've got everybody, all the stakeholder representatives, you can then say, well, we've got the complete set of them. And one thing I've never found a way of doing is measuring benefits of buildings. I'm not sure how you do that. All we're trying to do is to find building use and conditions, and especially the design solutions, to achieve the productivity and or well-being of people. So if we can design it that little bit better to enable people to achieve their work or their safety or health or something, then that's what we're trying to do. But I don't know how you could actually measure it. Yeah.
As yet, we need to figure that out.
Yeah.
Sounds like a PhD coming on.
More than one.
Any other last questions for Chris? Let me just check the chat list. Little hands, no little hands. Okay, thank you very, very much, Chris, and thank you for reminding us about the contribution that the school has historically had to well to the architectural profession. I hadn't realised what you said, but now you say it, it kind of makes sense when you think back to John Gray et al. Back in those times. So thank you very much. And let's show our response in the normal way with the old hand clap.
Thank you very much.